The Legend of Zelda is one of the greatest video game franchises of all time. It's been around almost 40 years and there's been numerous entries in the series. And while every game usually has the common tropes of the hero's journey and good versus evil, one theme that actually comes up a lot is time travel. In this series, I would like to take a look at the time travel in The Legend of Zelda to see if Nintendo used the mechanics correctly. Yes, this is a fantasy series. Yes, there is magic involved. Yes, the time travel doesn't have to make sense. But I'm curious if it does. If the time travel actually has some logic to it. So, if you'd like to take part in this thought experiment, let's get started. Timestamps will be listed below. Ocarina of Time is the first game in the series to feature time travel. It's also the game that caused the infamous timeline split. Let's map out our timeline. It's pretty straightforward in the beginning. Link gets the Kokiri's Emerald and then heads to Hyrule. After meeting Princess Zelda for the first time and getting the Goron's Ruby and Zora's Sapphire, he is able to open the Door of Time in the Temple of Time and take the Master Sword. So up to this point, everything is easy. It gets a little trickier once Link gets sealed in the Temple of Time. Link is sent forward 7 years until he is old enough to wield the Master Sword. So we have this 7-year jump on the timeline. Link then gets the first 4 sage medallions and awakens those sages. Although you can go back and forth between the past and the future as much as you want, probably the minimum amount of times you would actually have to do it is 2. Once to get the Lens of Truth and once to get the Silver Gauntlets. The first time Link goes back 7 years, from what the game tells us, it's 7 years from that moment. So in the past, he would have been sealed for a little bit before waking up to go get the Lens of Truth. That's what this small blue section of the timeline represents. We'll go over this in more detail in the next section, so don't worry. After getting the Lens of Truth, Link returns to the future 7 years from that moment and gets the Sage Medallion of Shadow. We get another trip to the past to get the Silver Gauntlets, and then once back in the future, Link gets the Sage Medallion of Spirit. Since this is the last time required for Link to go back to the past, we can fill in the rest of that 7-year period as having Link being sealed. Having all 6 Sage Medallions, Link returns to the Temple of Time, where Zelda reveals herself, but is captured by Ganondorf. With the help of the 6 sages, Link is able to assault Ganondorf's castle and have the final showdown. Once Ganondorf is defeated and sealed, Zelda, feeling guilty about taking away Link's childhood, sends him and Navi back to the past to just before Link ever meets Zelda. Quick note, the Door of Time should not be open here. Link does not have his Goron's bracelet, and you can't see any spiritual stones outside the Door of Time, so yeah, Nintendo goofed. Their journey complete, Navi leaves Link, and he proceeds to meet Zelda for the second time, where he warns her of Ganondorf's plans. Our completed timeline looks like this. Following Link's journey, we can see how the adult and child timelines are created. The adult timeline is everything Link does during the game, and the child timeline is what happens when Link changes events in the past. This is an example of multi-dimensional time. In singular dimensional time, or when there's only one single timeline, there is this rule called the Novikov self-consistency principle that says what happens in the past was and will always happen as it does to lead to the future we know. This is to prevent paradoxes in the timeline. If events changed in the past, then Link would never go through the events of Ocarina of Time and get sent back by Zelda in the first place. The past must happen exactly as it does in order to lead to the future that we get, or else we get a paradox. But with multi-dimensional time, where you can have branching timelines, paradoxes are allowed because if an event is changed in the past, then it just creates an alternate timeline where different events can happen. The original timeline can still occur and exist while also allowing a timeline where things happen differently. The adult timeline happens first, and Link goes through the events of the game. After defeating Ganon, when Zelda sends him back to before they meet, Link is able to warn Zelda because he already went through the events of the game and knows what will happen. If time was singular, then this should have been impossible, since originally Link never warned Zelda. But because time in this game is multi-dimensional, instead of Link causing a paradox, him changing the past just creates an alternate timeline where events happen differently. The adult timeline does not change because the events of its past are not changed. It's the events in the new timeline that are different. Also, the adult timeline continues without a Link because when Link gets sent back to the past, he leaves that timeline. He still exists, just in the child timeline. The future of the adult timeline still continues, but Link never returns. All of this explanation is correct in the official lore. If we're talking about the general rules of time travel in fiction though, this is not how things should have happened. But we'll come back to that in a later section. What about the downfall timeline? Where does it come from and why do we have it? Well, the short answer is because Nintendo said so. The long answer is there is no confirmed answer. The downfall timeline is supposed to split during the final battle with Ganon. Link loses and Ganon obtains the full Triforce. As a last resort, the sages seal Ganon away in the Sacred Realm with the Triforce, and he's left to mold it into his own image, leading up to A Link to the Past. The problem is, canonically, Link defeats Ganon and he's sealed away. If you play Ocarina of Time, this is what happens. There's no time travel that involves changing this final battle. Either you defeat Ganon as an adult, or the final battle never happens because Child Link prevents it from happening. Logically, there's no reason why the downfall timeline should exist. But, if we were trying to justify it, we do have an excuse. It's not the strongest argument, but it's plausible at least. So let me give you a theory. In Hyrule Historia page 92, it says, in regards to the downfall timeline, of all possible outcomes, Link, the hero of time, faced defeat at the hands of Ganondorf. Notice it says, of all possible outcomes. The first thing this makes me think of is quantum superposition, or more simply the idea of Schrodinger's cat. The basic explanation of superposition is that you can have every outcome of a situation exist at the same time. It's not really that simple, but for the average person, that's the common understanding. With the downfall timeline, it's not a split caused by time travel. It's more an alternate scenario where Link loses. While there could be multiple different ways the final battle could go, Nintendo chose to only have two possible outcomes be true. One where Link wins, and one where Ganon wins. Two possible outcomes existing at the same time in different timelines. We can also see this because the adult and downfall timelines have their own versions of Link, Zelda, and Ganon during the final battle. The split can't be caused by time travel, because the only travel after the battle is when Zelda sends Link back to his childhood, and as we know, that causes the child timeline, not the downfall. Why would this event cause a quantum timeline split and not every other event in the game? This is all just thinking out loud, but you could say that it's because this is a very important event in the timeline. This is a repeat of Demise's curse, and the result of this is world-changing. An additional reason could be that time during the events of Ocarina of Time is very loose, it's very malleable. Reality is not stable because of all the time manipulation, which might allow for a quantum split of this size. Again, this is all theory. Not the strongest argument, I'm just trying to give plausible reasons for why there is a downfall timeline, besides because Nintendo said so. Let's go over those blue gaps in the timeline first. Sheik says in the Temple of Time, if you want to return to your original time, return the Master Sword to the pedestal of time. By doing this, you will travel back in time 7 years. And in the Ice Cave, Sheik also says, time passes, people move, like a river's flow, it never ends. A lot of people interpret this to mean that however long adult Link spends in the future, that same amount of time goes by in the past, because the Master Sword specifically moves Link 7 years forward and backward in time. Meaning, if you are adult Link for a day, then a day goes by in the past as well. These blue sections in the timeline are periods where Link's body is sealed while he's in the past or future. This next part gets a little wild, so don't feel bad if you decide to skip ahead. The actual mechanics of the Master Sword, I have a problem with, and it's literally because of one reason. Link ages. In time travel, usually the character skips time. They do not take part in events while they are traveling, and they aren't affected by the flow of time, meaning they do not age. It's basically like the character is pulled out of the timeline and dropped further back or ahead. If you went forward 10 years, you would not age 10 years. You would be in the future the same age as you left the present. This problem breaks the logic of the Master Sword time travel. We are told by Rauru that Link's spirit is sealed for 7 years in the Sacred Realm because Link is too young to be the hero of time. There's two problems with this. The first, Link is basically put to sleep for 7 years while his body ages. That means he's not skipping time. Link isn't time traveling forward, he's just sleeping for 7 years. The other problem here is that now we, the player, know what Link is supposed to be doing in the timeline. He is supposed to be sealed in that first 7-year period. Usually in time travel stories with single timelines, we the viewer have no idea, or we vaguely know, what happens during the time that the main character travels, and we do not learn what events should happen until the end of the story, once all events are revealed. At the end of the story, we realize whatever events happened were supposed to have happened the whole time. If we are told exactly what happens, then we see the main character change what's supposed to happen. Then that contradicts a single timeline because events changed when they weren't supposed to. Rauru telling us, the player, that Link was sealed for 7 years creates issues, as we eventually learn that Link must go back to the past for the Lens of Truth and the Silver Gauntlets. How can Link go back to get those items if he's supposed to be sealed in that first 7-year period? That's what the game tells us. Unless Rauru was wrong and Link wasn't sealed for that entire 7-year period. Whether we look at the time period with the Master Sword as singular or multi-dimensional, we have problems. If we assume there is only one timeline when we travel with the sword, not talking about the adult-child or downfall splits, then events must follow that Novikov idea I mentioned before. If we are told Link is sealed for 7 years, then that's what the timeline would say. Link did nothing in that 7-year period because he was sealed. Therefore, he would not be able to go back to get the Lens of Truth or Silver Gauntlets. If he could, then the future would be different, because now Link should have had the Lens and Gauntlets before he awoke as an adult. There would not be a problem if Child Link got the Lens and Gauntlets before he awoke as an adult. There would not be a problem if Child Link got the Lens and Gauntlets and then was sealed for 7 years. If the game just didn't have Link go back to the past at all until the finale, then we wouldn't have any timeline contradictions. And Link would have those two items the entire time he's an adult. If we say that the time period with the Master Sword lets timeline splits happen, then going back to get the Lens of Truth would cause one split, and going back to get the Silver Gauntlets would cause another. This is because the original timeline says Link was sealed for 7 years. Getting those items would contradict that. Both of these split timelines would be problematic because once Link goes back to the future, both alternate futures would be different. Since Link goes forward 7 years, he would be sealed during the time where he would have got the first 4 medallions, meaning in all 3 timelines, he would not have all the medallions he needs to seal Ganon at the end of the game. There's a common idea that it's actually Link's consciousness that time travels forward. The only hint of this is when Rauru says Link's spirit is sealed for 7 years. Technically, this would also break that Novikov idea, because even though we don't know what happens to Link's body, the timeline would still say Link's spirit is sealed for that 7-year period. And again, it also causes issues, because Link should have awoken as an adult already with the Lens of Truth and Silver Gauntlets, because he would have gotten them as a child. From what the game tells us, the Master Sword time travel should not work. Even though it's one of the greatest games ever made, Ocarina of Time got the Master Sword time travel wrong. The Song of Storms paradox is probably the second most infamous time travel dilemma in the entire series, right after the timeline split. Where did the Song of Storms even come from? Link learns the song from the Phonogram Man in the windmill in Kakariko Village, but the Phonogram Man learns the song from Link in the past, so where did the song come from? Who wrote it? How can you have two characters teach each other the song, but have neither character actually write it? This is a perfect example of a causal loop. A causal loop is basically when a future event causes a past event, which in turn causes that future event. A thing in the future causes a thing in the past, but that past thing causes that future thing. Sounds confusing, I know. Chronologically, the second event comes first. The problem is the second event can't happen unless the first event happens first. As we play Ocarina of Time, adult Link must first learn the Song of Storms from the Phonogram Man in order to play it in the past to empty the well and get the Lens of Truth. When Link plays it in the past, he teaches the past version of the Phonogram Man the song. Where does the song come from then? Who taught who first? Who wrote the song? The simple answer is, it's impossible to know. These two events are what perpetuate the causal loop. Link teaches the Phonogram Man, who teaches Link, who teaches the Phonogram Man. It continues forever, and it's existed forever. If that idea is hard to understand, don't worry. That's the point of causal loops. We're not supposed to know. The Song of Storms has no beginning. The Song of Storms always was, and always will be. The central game mechanic of Majora's Mask is time travel, and it actually does a pretty good job implementing it. Let's map our timeline. Just like Ocarina, the first bit of Majora's Mask is pretty straightforward. The Skull Kid steals Epona and the Ocarina of Time. Link gets turned into a Deku scrub and teams up with Tattle the Fairy, and they meet the Happy Mask Salesman under the clock tower. When Link and Tattle emerge from the tower, we get the famous Dawn of the First Day message. They have 3 days to stop the Skull Kid and prevent the moon from falling. Before we go any further, I have to explain what a time loop is. A time loop is a concept from fiction, where a character gets stuck in a period of time that repeats over and over at least once. When the period of time restarts, the character returns to how they physically were at the start of the loop, but they remember everything that happened. Anything the character did in the previous loop gets erased, like it never happened. Events can happen differently each loop, because after a reset, it's like it never happened at all. The final loop, the character breaks the cycle, and the loop does not repeat. This last loop is what the timeline remembers. Time loops are an example of a concept that is meant for singular timelines, but can still get around the Novikov idea. Majora's Mask is a time loop. Link and Tattle get stuck in a 3-day time loop that repeats until the final loop when Link and Tattle defeat Majora's Mask. Every time Link plays the Song of Time, he restarts the loop at the dawn of the first day. The first time Link and Tattle emerge from below the clock tower, this is loop 1. In this loop, they are both confined to Clocktown because the guards will not let Deku Link pass. This is more of an introduction to the game to show the player the schedules of each townsperson and get familiar with the town itself. At the end of Loop 1, Link gets back the Ocarina of Time and remembers the Song of Time. When he plays it, him and Tattle are sent back to the beginning of the time loop, to the dawn of the first day. The events of Loop 1 basically never happen. Link technically should not have the Ocarina of Time, but for gameplay reasons he keeps it, since it would be annoying to redo the entire loop every time just to get the Ocarina. In the second loop, since Link has the Ocarina back, the Happy Mask Salesman teaches him the Song of Healing, and he is able to revert back to human Link. Link acquires the Deku Mask, and now that he can leave Clocktown, he frees the spirit of Woodfall Temple. It's probably safe to say that each temple requires one loop to complete, and just to make it easier, we'll say you need one loop for all side quests. It's probably more than one, but we'll just say one to make the explanation easier. That said, our timeline looks like this. After each temple is complete, Link would have to play the Ocarina of Time and reset the time loop. Again, technically resetting the loop should take away any items Link got during that cycle, but for gameplay reasons, he keeps key items. The final loop, having freed the spirits of each temple, Link is able to confront the Skull Kid at the top of the clock tower. After learning the real enemy is the mask itself, Link and Tattle journey inside the moon to have the final battle with the mask. The mask is defeated, the moon's falling is prevented, and Termina is safe. This is what breaks the loop. Since this last loop is not repeated, this is what the timeline remembers. Afterwards, the mask is given back to the happy mask salesman, and him and Link both leave Termina. The Song of Double Time and the inverted Song of Time are both examples of time dilation. Time dilation basically is how you experience time compared to other people. With the Song of Double Time, when Link plays it, he fast forwards time to the nearest dawn or dusk. From his perspective, it's seconds, but to the world, it's hours. With the inverted Song of Time, when Link plays it, he slows the flow of time. To him, he would perceive the world as moving slower, while the world sees him as moving faster. In-game, we see the timer at the bottom of the screen slow down. We also see events last longer, and characters take longer to complete their daily routines. From the character's perspective, Link would be moving faster than he normally would. How do we know it's a time loop? Well, the evidence is after the first time Link and Tattle go back to the dawn of the first day. Tattle's response is, "What just happened? Everything has started over." You see Clocktown as it was during the dawn of the first day, and the moon is back in the sky where it started at. Tattle's wording confirms it's a time loop. Link resets the time loop and everything is how it was 3 days earlier. Also, in Hyrule Historia page 112, it says, Link was able to rewind the passage of time to 3 days before the moon fell. Majora's Mask cannot be alternate timelines, for the simple reason that if the timeline in the game was multi-dimensional, when Link goes back 3 days, there would be 2 Links at the same time. Link who is only at the dawn of the first day, and Link who has already experienced those next 3 days. This does not happen in-game though. In-game, it's made pretty clear that time has started over. Link has infinite loops to get what he needs to defeat the Skull Kid and Majora's Mask. While the game follows the rules of time loops pretty well, it does break some, but not for story reasons, it's more for gameplay reasons. Link keeps important items like boss remains, masks, and tools after every loop. Technically, he should lose all of them, because the events of each loop where he obtains these items would be erased like they never happened. The reason he keeps these items is because it would be annoying for us, the player, if every time we reset the loop, we lost all of our progress. An in-game explanation for keeping Link's stuff is maybe the magic of the Ocarina, since it's the Ocarina of Time. But in reality, it's just so the game isn't annoying to play. If you are looking at the timeline, it would imply that Link freed all 4 spirits and completed all side quests in the last loop. In-game, that would not be possible, since completing all side quests requires multiple loops. But again, this is more gameplay design, as the time loop is used as part of the puzzles for the player to solve. In lore though, it would say Link did everything in the last loop. What if I told you that Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask had the same time loop mechanic? How would you feel if I said that the adult timeline should have been erased? Ocarina of Time is technically a time loop. Let's go over what a time loop is again. A character gets stuck in a period of time that repeats over and over at least once. When the period of time restarts, the character returns to how they were physically at the start of the loop, but they remember everything that happened. Anything the character did in the previous loop gets erased, like it never happened. Events can happen differently each loop because after a reset, it's like it never happened at all. The final loop, the character breaks the cycle, and the loop does not repeat. This last loop is what the timeline remembers. Does that sound familiar? Zelda sends Link back to the past to before he ever meets her. He becomes a child again, but he remembers everything he's done during the game. This is how he can warn Zelda and have Ganondorf captured before he can do anything. Zelda actually uses the Ocarina of Time at the end of the game, and she says that with it, she can return Link to his original time. Just like how Link uses the Ocarina to go back to the dawn of the first day in Majora's Mask. Remember, this last time travel is not the same as the Master Sword time travel. Time travel caused by the Ocarina works differently than the time travel caused by the Master Sword. Alternate timelines are created when a character goes back in time and changes events. You would think this is how the child timeline is created. The problem is, if Link actually went back in time like this, there would have been two Links. Link who had not met Zelda yet, and Link who had already gone through the events of Ocarina of Time. There are not two Links though. We see there is only one. Just like a time loop, the 7-year period we play in Ocarina of Time is the length of the time loop. The loop starts just before Link ever meets Zelda. When she sends him back from the future, she's actually resetting the time loop, and the events of Ocarina of Time should have been erased. Link goes back to how he physically was just before he met Zelda for the first time, but he remembers the previous loop. This is how he can warn Zelda and have Ganondorf captured. Remember, time loops can happen with only one repeat of the loop. Also, since this repeated loop doesn't get reset, it becomes the canon timeline. Even if you think Zelda sends Link's consciousness back in time, similar to how the Master Sword time travel kind of works, then where is Link's body in the future? If only his consciousness got sent back, then his body should have stayed in the future. But it didn't, because that's not what happens. The loop is reset, and Link goes back to being the child he was before he met Zelda. The adult timeline should have been erased, but the reason it continues, even though it shouldn't, is because Nintendo doesn't understand time travel concepts that well. In lore, you could argue that Zelda makes the adult timeline keep existing because she is the Sage of Time. Therefore, Ocarina of Time is technically a time loop. The adult timeline should have been erased. The only timeline that should exist is the child timeline.